You're listening to Tea with Tolkien, a podcast for the Hobbit at heart. Join us as we chat about the works and faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to carry a little piece of Middle-earth into our own daily lives. This will be the first in a 7-part book club series on The Lord of the Rings, so these episodes will be released on the first of each month from now through March to accompany our book club as we are reading The Lord of the Rings together. If you would like to join our book club, you can visit teawithtolkien.com/book-club. Now, because our book club finished the Silmarillion earlier this spring, this discussion is going to contain some Silmarillion spoilers and references. Having read the Silmarillion is in no way a prerequisite for enjoying The Lord of the Rings. However, it does enrich one's understanding. And I would also like to point out that Tolkien himself frequently spoils the Silmarillion as he writes it, and the Silmarillion has been out for a few dozen years, so I don't feel too bad about spoiling it. However, I do feel a little bit bad. So if you would like to read the Silmarillion before listening to these episodes, you can visit teawithtolkien.com/Silmarillion to find all of our resources that I have published on the book, including my new Silmarillion Reader's Guide ebook, which is available now for only $4 and is also free to patrons. If you would like to support Tea with Tolkien on Patreon, you can learn more about all of that at patreon.com/teawithtolkien. Now, before we begin discussing Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings, which is the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring, I wanted to note that we are not going to be looking at The Lord of the Rings as a formal allegory, which we all know Tolkien himself detested. His characters, settings, and plot are not mere stand-ins for biblical characters, world wars, political parties, or anything else you might feel tempted to equate them with. Rather, The Lord of the Rings stands on its own as an epic story first and foremost, filled to the brim with great depth and meaning. However, Tolkien himself also described The Lord of the Rings as a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. The very fibers of Middle-earth are woven together by his Catholic philosophy. So when we speak about echoes, reflections, or glimpses of Christianity in Tolkien's works, we are not seeking to allegorize it. Instead, we are seeking to acknowledge the worldview that Tolkien held to so firmly that it poured over into every page of his writing. That being said, you don't have to be Catholic to love The Lord of the Rings, obviously, or to participate in this book club. Because I'm trying to look at this work in light of the faith that the author and myself both share, there are definitely going to be mentions of Catholicism and different Catholic terms or doctrine as they pertain to whatever we're reading and our study. But this isn't to say that this book club is exclusively for Catholics. In fact, it's extremely important to me that people of all beliefs and traditions feel welcome in our community. So if you are unfamiliar with Catholicism, my hope is that these discussions will offer a brief and I'm sure imperfect introduction to the faith that Tolkien himself was so devoted to. My hope with everything I do here at Tea with Tolkien is to foster a love for beauty and truth as it is present in Tolkien's world. And so discussing his own Catholic philosophy is a pretty important part of that. So with all of that out of the way, let's begin with Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings, which is once again the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring. Chapter 1, A Long-Expected Party. 60 years after returning home to Bag End from his unexpected adventure, Bilbo Baggins has become a legend among hobbits. Though nearing his 11th birthday, he has not aged visibly since he was 50, and his unexplained youth and wealth have become a popular topic of gossip throughout the Shire. As the 22nd of September draws closer, all of Hobbiton is busy making preparations for a party of special magnificence, a combined birthday celebration for Bilbo and his nephew and heir, Frodo Baggins. As packages and parcels pour into Bag End, Gandalf the Wizard also arrives in the Shire, though he comes with far more difficult and dangerous business than anyone realizes. The Baggins' celebration exceeds all expectations as gifts are generously given to all of the guests, several hearty meals are served, and Gandalf's fireworks light up the evening sky. At a special supper set apart for family, the hobbits eat to their heart's content and then brace themselves for one of Bilbo's infamous birthday speeches. However, his speech comes to an unsettling end as he announces, "This is the end. I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye," and vanishes, followed by a blinding flash of light. Gandalf returns to Bag End shortly after to find Bilbo making his final preparations to leave the Shire forever. As an old friend, Gandalf counsels Bilbo to leave behind the ring. However, he agrees to it at first, but then his heart changes and he becomes pretty angry with Gandalf. Ultimately, though, he chooses to leave the ring behind of his own will. Frodo returns home later that night and finds Gandalf sitting alone beside the fire, and he realizes that Bilbo has finally gone. Gandalf explains that he has left all of Bag End, including his ring, to Frodo. Gandalf warns him not to use the ring, to keep it safe and secret, and that he must leave to learn more about its nature. So there's something that Bilbo says in this chapter that also made it into the movies, and it's a quote that I think we should spend a minute talking about. Bilbo says, "Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like butter that has been scraped over too much bread. That can't be right. I need a change or something." Now, the obligations of home life or workplace responsibilities, the burdens of difficult relatives, all of this can make you feel overwhelmed. However, these are not the root of Bilbo's suffering. In truth, he feels this way because the ring is slowly working to possess him. Now, there are seasons of life or vocations that will stretch a person in a healthy way, offering the opportunity for growth or sanctification through suffering. And then there are habits and lifestyles that will stretch a person in a detrimental way, drawing them away from their purpose, responsibilities, etc. You may find yourself restless or distracted with an obsession or a disordered attachment to whatever it might be. And this is really how Bilbo is feeling due to the ring. To put it plainly, a well-lived life does not stretch a person in the way that the ring does. And so already in the first chapter, we can see how powerful the ring is, even though it doesn't seem terribly apparent. It's just this kind of subtle way that it's been gnawing at Bilbo. And yet from Bilbo's perspective, the ring has brought him a lot of benefits, or so it would seem. He hasn't aged since he came home from his unexpected adventure, and he had been using the ring on several occasions to avoid uncomfortable situations. So from his perspective, the ring really isn't such a bad thing at all. And I feel like that can definitely be a relatable feeling. However, ultimately, Bilbo was able to let go of the ring. And I think this is really important to recognize that this is the first time in the history of the ring that I'm aware of that someone has willingly given up the ring of their own free will. And I think that is a huge testament to the goodness and just the wholesome nature of hobbits, that Bilbo was able to let go of the ring pretty easily compared to how other people have held on to it. This also kind of brings up the question of why was Bilbo able to do so specifically? And I think this is something that we'll learn more as we get into the next chapter. Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. As word of Bilbo's disappearance spreads throughout Hobbiton, his name is once again the center of scandal, earning him the title of Mad Baggins. Though several years have now passed, Frodo continues to give birthday parties for Bilbo, insisting he does not believe Bilbo is dead. While Frodo remains in Bag End, his mind begins to wander to distant lands, and he becomes more peculiar in the eyes of his neighbors. Part of me wonders if this is the influence of the ring or if this is just normal Frodo behavior. Frodo occasionally hosts traveling dwarves, bringing whispers of the enemy and of Mordor, and a sense of unease slowly spreads. After 9 years away, 9 years, if you have only watched the Lord of the Rings movies, I feel like you would be surprised by this quite a large passage of time. After 9 years away, Gandalf suddenly returns to Bag End. He begins to explain that he has come to understand. He begins to explain what he's come to understand about Bilbo's ring, its history, how Bilbo came to find it, and its great power. He recounts the story of how the ring came to Smeagol, how it immediately took hold of his heart, and how his lust for the ring caused Smeagol to murder his dear friend and eventually become this wretched creature known as Gollum. Gandalf tells of how the ring chose to leave Gollum eventually and how it was by a chance of fate picked up by Bilbo. Gandalf kind of points out that the ring gave Gollum abilities according to his stature. Tolkien writes that even before Smeagol came to find the ring, he was interested in roots and beginning. He dived into deep pools, he burrowed under trees and growing plants, he tunneled into green mounds, and he ceased to look up at the hilltops or the leaves on trees or the flowers opening in the air. His head and eyes were downward. And so when Smeagol did have the ring, Tolkien writes that he used it to find out secrets, and he put his knowledge to crooked and malicious uses, until eventually he wormed his way like a maggot into the Misty Mountains, thinking to himself, "The roots of those mountains must be roots indeed. There must be great secrets buried there, which have not been discovered since the beginning." I also want to point out in this chapter that Gandalf casually mentions that Gollum eats babies, which is something I've overlooked in the past. It might not be true. Gollum allegedly eats babies, I think, is a little bit of a more fair way to put it. Gollum has been accused of eating babies. And I think this really emphasizes just how evil he has become under the influence of the ring, if it's true. Gandalf also then tells Frodo that the ring cannot stay in the Shire, and though he's filled with dread, Frodo agrees that he will carry the ring to Rivendell. As the chapter draws to a close, Gandalf chooses Samwise Gamgee to accompany Frodo on his journey. So, a major theme in this chapter is the idea of providence. Something else is at work. Gandalf says to Frodo, "Behind that there was something else at work beyond any design of the ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which you were also meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought." So as Gandalf reflects that Frodo was meant to carry the ring just as Bilbo was meant to find it, we're introduced to this role of providence or fate in The Lord of the Rings. Something which brings good out of all evil is at work, and despite the greatness of Sauron, providence is greater. To recognize our place in the plans of providence should be an encouraging thought, a comfort to rest in. And yet, Frodo doesn't feel comforted at all. Indeed, he feels ill-equipped, wrong for the task he was given. He asks Gandalf why he was chosen, and though Gandalf can't really give him a very helpful answer, he says, "You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, not for power or wisdom at any rate. But you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as you have." And that kind of advice might sound depressing at first, but if you do really kind of reflect on it and think about it, it's actually very comforting and strengthening, because I feel like all of us at one point or another feel like we're ill-equipped to handle whatever we've been given. But if you kind of acknowledge the idea of providence and fate and that something else is at work, and all you have to do is kind of just like put one foot in front of the other with whatever task you've been given. That's really all that you can expect yourself to do. Just as Frodo was chosen to carry this burden, we all have a part to play in the history of our world. And though it can feel overwhelming or impossible, I just want you to take comfort in knowing that you don't have to do it alone. Something which brings good out of all evil is at work, and despite the greatness of Sauron, providence is greater. Chapter 3. 3 is company. Guided by Gandalf's counsel, Frodo begins preparations to leave the Shire, although extremely slowly. This chapter is so funny to me because Gandalf is kind of like, Frodo, you were in grave, massive, huge danger, the most amount of danger possible. And Frodo is like, "Oh, yeah, okay, I'll work on it. I'm not quite ready yet, though. Let me wait till the fall. I might feel more like adventuring then." And so Frodo, in an, I think, classic Hobbit fashion, is very slow to go. Eventually, though, he sells Bag End to the Sackville Bagginses, and he purchases a small home in Crickhollow, although he doesn't actually intend to live in it. Gandalf leaves once again, promising to return before autumn. However, he's not heard from again for quite some time. Frodo finally sets out walking along with Samwise and Pippin towards Crickhollow on the day after his 50th birthday. As he's just about to set out, he overhears the gaffer speaking about him to a mysterious person, but he resists his curiosity and continues on. Frodo, Sam, and Pippin travel on foot through the woods, walking leisurely and taking their time. Fearing no danger, they sleep beneath the trees at night and rest often during the day. As they travel slowly, the hobbits hear a horse coming down the road, and Frodo urges them to scramble off the road. And here we've got the classic movie line where Frodo's like, "I think we should get off the road. Get off the road, quick." So they get off the road, they scramble out of sight, and as they hide, Frodo watches as a dark, faceless figure sitting upon a black horse rides slowly towards them. In the presence of this Black Rider, Frodo is filled with dread and a nearly overwhelming desire to put on the ring. However, they are not discovered at this time by the rider, and eventually they continue on. Soon forgetting their danger, which is so funny to me because 2 seconds ago they were in grave peril, and then they pretty quickly forget about it. After that, they hear the sound of hooves again, and then they see a shadow crawling towards them. So creepy. However, the shadow is scared away by the sudden singing of elves along the road. The elves welcome them as friends, offering them food, drink, and a safe place to rest for the night. These elves are so funny to me because they're like, oh, sorry about this. Our hospitality is not that great right now. If you come to our homes, it'll be a lot better. And for the hobbits, they're like, this is the greatest meal that I've ever had. During this time, Gildor offers Frodo some unsettling advice, though he is thankful for his company and counsel. Though Frodo sees the Shire as a refuge from the dangers of the world, he soon comes to understand that even the safety and familiarity of the Shire cannot forever shield him from the enemy. Gildor gave him this counsel. He says, "But it is not your own Shire. The wide world is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out." Because of this conversation, Frodo comes to a better understanding of the strength of Sauron, and he's beginning to realize the depth of his quest and just how desperately he needs courage. Chapter 4. A Shortcut to Mushrooms. After spending the night in the protection of the elves, the hobbits awake refreshed in body and spirit. However, Frodo is troubled over the thought of bringing his friends with him into such grave danger, and he also knows and he's also really going to miss the Shire. He's really coming to grips with the fact that he's leaving, he might not ever come back, and he doesn't really know how to tell his friends. As they continue to scramble through the woods to avoid the Black Rider, the hobbits find themselves walking through the farmlands of the farmer Maggot. Now, Frodo is dreadfully terrified of Farmer Maggot's dogs because when he was a kid, he was caught stealing mushrooms from him. And yet, despite this, Maggot welcomes the hobbits warmly, inviting them in for dinner. Inside, Maggot tells them of a strange man who had been asking for Mr. Baggins, and Frodo continues to try to keep his errand a secret, though he's acting really awkward and everyone knows he's got some kind of a secret. It's just a generally uncomfortable time. After dinner, Maggot offers to give the hobbits a ride to the ferry in his wagon, and they are extremely grateful for that. Along the road, they are met by a hooded rider, and this fills them with terror because they think it's the Black Rider, and they are pleasantly surprised to realize it's actually Merry Brandybuck. Reunited with Merry, they travel together to Frodo's home at Crick Hollow. This chapter is really short, and yet I think it's really important because it kind of emphasizes the kind of Hobbiton hospitality, I guess I'd call it. The way that Maggot is so willing to not only let them into his home, feed them a huge dinner, but after that he goes out of his way to give them a ride. And while I don't think he realizes how much danger he is in, he does put himself out into a lot of danger to do this for them. So kind of just another example of Hobbiton culture. And I feel like it just further shows what Hobbiton hospitality is like, how hobbits take care of each other. And it kind of endears us to the Shire just a little bit more. Chapter 5, A Conspiracy Unmasked. Frodo, Sam, and Pippin are reunited with Merry, and together they travel to Crick Hollow. They sense that they're being followed, and they try to push this thought from their minds, and eventually they arrive at Crick Hollow, where they are welcomed by the warmth and comfort of Frodo's newly purchased home. Surrounded by his belongings and good friends, Frodo wishes so dearly that he could stay, and he's dreading telling his friends about his true intentions to leave. After everyone takes baths, the hobbits eat a hearty dinner, and afterwards they pull up their chairs beside the fire to talk. Pippin and Sam recount the events of the past few days while Frodo struggles to remain silent. Finally, he attempts to tell his friends of his burden and his quest, but instead they reveal that they already know about it. Yet when Frodo explains that he intends to leave without them, Sam, Pippin, and Merry assure him that they've already planned to go with him and they're already ready to go. Even after warning them of their grave danger, Frodo's friends are committed to help him. Frodo is really relieved by this, and so Frodo is taken aback and kind of upset at first, but eventually he kind of just realizes how relieved he is and they plan to start off the following morning through the Old Forest. While Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin prepare to leave, their other friend, Fatty Bolger, remains behind just in case Gandalf should come, and also because Fatty just isn't really willing to go along on that quest. And I think it's important to note that there are many different kinds of friendship, and not every friend that you have needs to be willing to walk to Mordor with you. There are different friends for different seasons and needs, and I don't think Fatty is a bad friend in any way. As they rest for the night, Frodo sleeps uneasily and he has strange dreams. Up until this point, Tolkien has spent the majority of the book immersing us in Hobbit culture, which for the most part is incredibly endearing. He does this not only because it makes for a good story, but because it helps us to realize just how great a sacrifice Frodo is making. And as we continue reading along, we'll begin to see the stark contrast between the safety of life at Bag End and the reality of the wide world that it's all about him. I also love that we're able to see and experience Frodo's grief over the loss of the Shire and how it's so painful for him to say goodbye. I think it really adds a lot of depth to the story. Another thing in this chapter is the really great example of friendship, heroic friendship, and the way that friendship requires a lot of trust and give and take. Frodo says, "But it does not seem that I can trust anyone," to which his friends reply, "It all depends on what you want. You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin to the bitter end, and you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone or go off without a word. We are your friends, Frodo. We are horribly afraid, but we are coming with you, or following you like hounds." This kind of friendship is something so rarely seen in today's culture, in my opinion. We've been trained since childhood that we can't expect anything of our friends, we can't rely on anyone, we can't trust anyone but ourselves. And when you compare that kind of a culture to the way that they live in Hobbiton, it's just a huge difference. And I really don't think, as we continue on reading, that Frodo would be able to get even through he wouldn't even be able to make it through the next couple of chapters without his friends. And so the way that they're willing to sacrifice so much and to go with him is so important. And not only that, he also is willing to accept help. So true friendship requires trust, vulnerability, dedication from everyone involved. It's not as if you can't just have a one-sided friendship. There's a lot of mutual respect and mutual trust required. Chapter 6. The Old Forest. Early the next morning, the hobbits leave quietly through the mist toward a hidden entrance to the Old Forest. As they start going, Merry starts telling them all kinds of tales about the Old Forest, legends and tales, which leave everyone feeling very uneasy, and it pretty clearly sets us up for what's about to happen. After they enter, they find the forest is just as strange as all of the stories Merry has told them. The trees seem to shift as they pass through, leading them down a path which brings them deeper into the heart of forest. Despite their efforts, the hobbits find themselves in the middle of the forest at the river Withywindle. As Merry leads them, the hobbits soon become too hot and just incredibly tired. Merry and Pippin lean against the trunk of a great willow tree and fall into a deep sleep. Frodo dips his feet into the water to cool his toes, and he suddenly falls asleep with his back against a tree. Sam struggles to stay awake, becoming even more suspicious of the trees, until he hears a great splash and he finds that Frodo has fallen into the river. After rescuing him, Frodo tells Sam he thinks that the tree threw him into the water, and then suddenly they realize Merry and Pippin have been swallowed up into the cracks of the willow tree. The hobbits make a little fire to try and free their friends. However, this is a bad idea. Merry begs them to put out the fire or the tree will squeeze him in two. Frodo cries frantically for help, though he doesn't really understand why. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, they hear the merry voice of Tom Bombadil singing as he's walking through the forest. Tom has heard Frodo's cry for help and quickly rescues Merry and Pippin from the Old Man Willow, using only song to command the trees, which is crazy. After freeing him, he continues to sing, walking ahead and calling for them to follow. Which leads us quite nicely to Chapter 7, in the house of Tom Bombadil. The hobbits step into the home of Tom Bombadil and stand in awe of their surroundings. Before them sits Goldberry, daughter of the river, who greets them warmly and welcomes them into the safety of her home. Goldberry prepares dinner as the hobbits wash up, and they eat a long, merry meal together. Afterwards, Goldberry bids them goodnight, and the hobbits sit with Tom for a while. They talk for a bit, but then Tom tells them that many things are best left until morning, and so he leads them to go to sleep. As they're about to go to sleep, Goldberry gives them this really peaceful nighttime blessing almost. She says, "Have peace now until the morning. Heed no nightly noises, for nothing passes door and window here save moonlight and starlight and the wind off the hilltop. Good night." In the morning, they have a hearty breakfast, and they are gladdened by the sound of rain as it will delay their departure. They sit again with Tom, and he explains a whole bunch about the old forest, telling them about the cunning of the great willow, and then his stories turn to the great barrows, the Barrow-wights, and more. The hobbits sit as if in a trance, and then Frodo asks Tom Bombadil, "Who are you, master?" Tom answers that he is the eldest, here before all, even the Dark Lord. Very mysterious and a bit confusing. After the rain comes to an end, Tom and Goldberry have a great supper with the hobbits, and then they talk for a lot longer. And at this time, Frodo shows the ring to Tom and is surprised that Tom Bombadil is unaffected by the ring in any way. He doesn't want it, and he isn't fooled by it. He's still able to see Frodo even when he puts it on. So Tom is just completely unaffected by the ring, which is extremely cool and mysterious. That evening, the hobbits prepare to depart from Tom's house, planning to head towards the north at his advice in the next morning. This chapter presents the natural world as it might exist apart from fallen humanity in a way. Just as the earth that surrounds Tom Bombadil's home has been unharmed and unchanged by the will of men, Tom Bombadil himself is completely independent from the ring. He is master. Tom Bombadil preserves the earth as it should be. Though he holds dominion over it, he doesn't seek to control it, and he cares for it without trying to change it. He seeks to learn from it without wanting to experiment on it, and he enjoys the benefits of its fruit without emptying it. Now, the old forest, by contrast, has been greatly damaged by the choices of humanity. Its trees have been chopped down and burned, its earth has been damaged, and in response, it reacted negatively to the hobbits. Also, it's enchanted too, so it's not just like a normal forest. Looking at those two with that light is very interesting. And I also have a couple discussion questions about Tom Bombadil that I would love to see everyone talking about in our Discord server. What do you suppose it means that Tom Bombadil is called Master, and why do you think he's unaffected by the ring? In one of his letters, Tolkien writes that Tom represents the spirit of the Oxford countryside, and also that he may be seen as an allegory for natural science, which seeks only knowledge and wisdom, but never dominion or ownership. How do these comments help you understand Tom or change the way that you look at his character? There's a lot to talk about with Tom Bombadil. I actually did a podcast on Tom Bombadil a couple years ago. So if you just look up Tea with Tolkien, Tom Bombadil, I'm sure you'll find it. If you are interested in hearing more about Tom Bombadil, because he's one of the best characters and he wasn't in the movies. So a lot of people who are reading the books for the first time are quite surprised by him. Chapter 8, Fog on the Barrow Downs. After breakfast, the hobbits say farewell to Tom Bombadil and Goldberry and continue towards the Barrow Downs. In the afternoon, they rest and eat lunch in the grass, falling into a deep, unexpected sleep. They awaken, surrounded by an unsettling fog, and they try to lead their ponies towards the road. However, instead of coming to the end of the Barrow Downs, Frodo finds himself passing between two ominous standing stones. This whole chapter has an extremely creepy vibe to it, and I love it. When Frodo looks back, he realizes he's become separated from the others, and he finds himself then standing before a great barrow. Unable to run, he watches as a tall, dark figure leans over him and seizes him with an icy grip. Frodo awakens in a barrow, and he realizes he's been taken by a Barrow-wight. For a moment, he's overcome with terror and dread, but he is soon filled with an unexpected sense of courage. Courage comes from unlikely places, if you'll remember. He turns to see Sam, Merry, and Pippin lying beside him, clad in white and surrounded by many treasures. He hears a song growing in the darkness, becoming an incantation, and then he sees a long, disembodied arm crawling towards them. So creepy. For a moment, Frodo imagines himself escaping with the ring and leaving his friends behind, but he knows that the courage in his heart has grown too strong and he could never leave his friends. So Frodo takes the sword and swings it at the crawling arm and cuts it off at the wrist. In the darkness, then, he remembers Tom Bombadil and calls for him, and then immediately Tom Bombadil bursts in and rescues the hobbits, awakening Sam, Merry, and Pippin with his song. Afterward, Tom walks beside them until they reach the road, and then the hobbits continue alone towards the Prancing Pony. Chapter 9, At the Sign of the Prancing Pony. After saying goodbye to Tom Bombadil, the hobbits continue on towards Bree. When they come to the village gate, they are met by curiosity and suspicion, but they are allowed in after just a few moments. Just as the gatekeeper turns away, however, an unnoticed shadow slips over the gate into Bree. The hobbits make for the prancing pony, where they hope to find Gandalf, but are disappointed to learn he hasn't arrived before or been heard from. After settling into their nice, hobbit-sized accommodations, they join the rest of the guests in the common room, although Merry instead goes for a walk. There, Frodo notices a strange-looking, weather-beaten man watching and listening to the hobbits, and he learns from Mr. Butterbur that he is a ranger called Strider. Frodo approaches him but is distracted by Pippin as he recounts the story of Bilbo's farewell party. This is unhelpful of Pippin because Frodo's kind of trying to, not cause a scene, not get any attention. However, in an attempt to draw the attention away from Pippin, Frodo leaps onto the table and begins to give a short speech followed by a song. And as he sings, he leaps into the air, falling off the table and disappearing without a trace. So, great job, Frodo. The ring had slipped onto his finger unexpectedly, and his disappearance has caused quite a commotion within the tavern. Frodo takes off the ring, appearing, and then he tries to convince Mr. Butterbur that it was all just a misunderstanding. However, the patrons of the Prancing Pony have grown quite upset over it all, and Frodo decides to return to his room. Frodo, Pippin, and Sam return to their parlor, unknowingly accompanied by Strider. He explains that he already knows a great deal about their secret, and he had been looking for a Mr. Frodo Baggins. He warns them that they are being closely pursued by the Black Riders, urging them to leave Bree in the morning and asking if they will have him as their guide. Although the hobbits initially distrust Strider, Frodo continues asking questions and trying to discern his path. Mr. Butterbur comes in knocking at the door, carrying a letter from Gandalf, which he was meant to send 3 months ago. Thank you to Mr. Butterbur. In the letter, Gandalf explains he must leave at once, and he urges Frodo to leave the Shire before the end of July. He also mentions that they may meet a friend on the road called Strider, and he will help them along the way to Rivendell. In the postscript of this letter, Gandalf writes a short poem about Strider, whose true name is Aragorn. So it would have been incredibly helpful for Frodo to have received this letter in a timely manner, but what can you do? After reading the letter, Frodo decides to trust Strider, who vows, "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and if by life or death I can save you, I will." Strider plans to travel first to Weathertop, where they will then have to choose between great perils as they continue to Rivendell. Soon, Merry rushes into their room, saying he had seen the Black Riders in the village. Strider warns them not to return to their room, instead suggesting they remain together in the parlor and bar the windows and doors. Heeding Strider's advice, the hobbits sleep on the floor beside the fire as Strider sits and watches. Chapter 11. A Knife in the Dark. Back at Frodo's home in Crickhollow, Fatty Bolger is filled with a growing fear. Night deepens, the leaves stir, and a menacing voice calls at the door, "Open in the name of Mordor." Fatty wastes no time running out the back door towards the nearest home to sound the alarm. The Black Riders burst open the door, rushing into the home to find it empty, and then return to their horses just as swiftly. In Bree, Strider awakens the hobbits and shows them to their bedrooms, where the windows had been forced open, the beds and linens were torn, and the brown mat which lay as a dummy was ripped to pieces. The hobbits are quite glad that they heeded Strider's advice to sleep in the common room, and they agree they should all leave at once. After their ponies had been scared away by the Black Riders, Mr. Butterbur purchases Bill Ferny's pony for the hobbits on their journey. After breakfast, they leave Bree and begin to follow Strider as he leads them along the way. They soon come to the Midgewater Marshes, which is quite a miserable place, where they spend days miserably scrambling and being bitten by midges. After several days, they finally come to Weathertop. There, they make camp and sit beside the fire. Frodo is filled with a sudden fear, and Merry reports that he saw 2 or 3 black shapes moving towards them. Frodo is overcome with the desire to put on the ring, and when he does, everything changes. Once again, bad idea, Frodo. He sees before him 5 tall figures robed in gray and carrying a sword of steel. As one of them comes upon him, he cries, "O Elbereth, Gilthoniel," striking at the figure's feet. But soon he feels an icy pierce of a sword into his left shoulder. With the last gasp of his strength, Frodo pulls the ring from his finger. Chapter 12. Flight to the Ford. As Frodo pulls the ring from his finger, he returns to himself, though gravely wounded. Strider instructs the hobbits to keep Frodo safe while he searches for leaves of the Athelas plant to treat his wound. When he returns, he throws the leaves into boiling water and washes Frodo's shoulder with it. They continue on towards Rivendell, though moving slowly through the wild and pathless lands. Sam is pretty afraid at this point for Frodo's life, and he gets more and more afraid with each passing day because Frodo is getting terribly ill. As they continue, they find themselves at the troll hole, where the very trolls which had been turned into stone on Bilbo's great adventure still stand. At this, their hearts and spirits are lifted, if only for a moment. As they continue on, they hear the sound of hooves drawing near, but they are relieved to see that it is not a Black Rider, but it's an elf named Arwen. Just kidding, it's Glorfindel. Arwen isn't in this chapter. That's the movie. He explains that he had been sent from Rivendell to look for them, and he urges Frodo to ride ahead of them on his horse. As they draw close to the river, Glorfindel senses the enemy is upon them. In their presence, Frodo hesitates to flee. Realizing that he's being silently commanded by the Black Riders to wait, though, Tolkien writes that fear and hatred awoke in him. He draws his sword, but Glorfindel commands his horse to continue to run. Frodo makes it across the ford, but the riders are close behind. As one rider approaches him, Frodo draws his sword and cries, "Go back to the land of Mordor and follow me no more." But the Black Riders call for the ring and continue to cross through the water. However, they are suddenly overcome by a cavalry of waves, crested with white flames. As Frodo watches, he feels himself falling and he sees no more. The end of book 1. That was crazy. So just a couple of key themes to wrap up from book 1, and then we will move over to our discussion in our Discord server. The main themes that I took away from book 1 are that Tolkien wants to establish a love for the Shire. He spends so much time describing Hobbit culture and all of its endearing quirks because he wants us to understand what Frodo is going to give up and how different the whole rest of the world is than the Shire. He also wants us to understand that the role of Providence is going to be quite important as we continue on. The idea that Frodo was meant to carry the ring. There's also a lot of emphasis placed on friendship and the idea that we all belong to each other. And as I was reflecting on this theme, I realized, the book is called The Fellowship of the Ring. So, of course, fellowship, friendship, and the way that everyone is kind of interconnected and we all depend on each other is going to be important, obviously. There's a lot more to talk about with this book, but I really wanted this episode to not be too long. Just kind of want it to be a quick run through of each chapter so that we can discuss it more on our Discord server, like I said earlier. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I loved reading this book and I'm super excited to discuss everything with you all. If you are not a part of our Discord server yet, you can sign up for it. You will get the link in your email if you sign up for our book club at teawithtolkien.com/book-club. I'm going to be doing, so the way our book club works is that there's a text-based channel and it's called Lord of the Rings Book 1, where we'll be discussing this book specifically. And then on September 11th and September 25th, we will be on the voice channel of our Discord server, chatting about it. So there's a lot of text-based chat, and then there's going to be voice chat. We'll probably do some more voice chats at other times too. But the book club is pretty low commitment. You can kind of just hop on whenever you want. It should be a lot of fun. It's fun to read books that we love, even if this is your first time or if this is your 10th time. It's all a lot of fun to discuss it with other people and to have someone to kind of read along with. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me on Twitter or Instagram at teawithtolkien, or by using the contact form on my website, teawithtolkien.com. And this episode isn't really sponsored by anybody because I don't really do sponsorships. But if you are interested in diving deeper into the Lord of the Rings, I wrote a book called To Middle-earth and Back Again, which is a companion journal and devotional to go along with Lord of the Rings. So it's kind of similar to this podcast episode, whereas we do a summary of each chapter with a little bit of reflection, and then there's room for your own notes. So that is available on my website as well. So this episode has been quite long. I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back on the 1st of October with Lord of the Rings Book 2.